Holy shit! Pop, 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 pop.
The Ruger SR-22 is the very first firearm that I bought myself. This very first firearm that I owned. So let's take a closer look at it. So this is the Ruger SR-22. It's a semi-automatic 22 LR. Essentially it's based on the old Ruger 1022. So if you're familiar with the old 1022, then you're basically familiar with this. All the controls are the same, all the internals are the same. This is literally a 1022 that's been built inside of a new stock, essentially. Like the 1022, it's very reliable. In my opinion, it's one of, if not the most reliable semi-automatic 22 rifle. Of course, because it shares all the same internals with the popular 1022, there's a lot of aftermarket. If you do want to modify or change anything, you can essentially change anything that you want. Now, all SR-22s to a point are customized because the gun comes with no sights. When you get the gun out of the box, there are no rails on it and there's no sights. It's not the best value. If you're looking for a value alternative, you can always buy a Ruger 1022 and then buy a different stock for it and change that out. Now keep in mind, if you were to buy this stock separately to convert a 1022 into an SR-22, you'd be looking at probably $250 to $300. This is all aluminum, so it is very well built. It definitely does not feel cheap or flimsy. If anything, actually, it is maybe a little too heavy for some people's preferences. The gun comes with a 6-position buttstock. Very similar to the buttstock, of course, that you would see on an AR-15 or an M4. Simply push on the lever and move the stock to the length that you want. As I mentioned, the controls are fairly unique to the 1022. If you're familiar with the 1022, you're familiar with all the controls: charging handle, magazine release. We have a crossbolt safety and the trigger. If you're familiar with the 1022, then you'll be familiar with this. This is a standard Ruger BX10 10-round magazine. The same magazine that, of course, works on the 1022 works on the SR-22. As I said, they're the exact same thing internally. If you're not familiar with the Rugers, this is a cylindrical magazine, which as far as I know is fairly unique to Ruger and extremely reliable. This is part of the reason why the 1022 is so reliable, is this magazine design. The rounds actually load in on an angle, and they actually circle around a center hub. So the hub is spring-loaded centrifugally, and the rounds rotate around the hub. And now I've also got a few of these. This is a Butler Creek 25-round magazine. Ruger does make an official 25-round magazine, but unfortunately here in Canada, those are prohibited. It just has to do with the way that they're advertised. Whereas all of the aftermarket 25-round magazines we can get no problem. So the stock 10-round magazines are very, very reliable. In fact, using CCI ammo, I don't think I've had a single FTF or FTE, what I will call a jam. I haven't had a single jam or misfire situation. They've basically been flawless. They're really easy to load. And over time, if the spring does lose tension, you can actually open them up and wind the spring even tighter, because like I said, it's centrifugal. So you can twist the thing over and over and over again and make the spring tension tighter. Now the cool thing about the 10-round magazines on a Ruger, once again same as a 1022, is that when they load in, it loads in flush. The 25-round magazine here Like I said, this is a Butler Creek, and here in Canada, we cannot get the official Ruger 25 round magazines. We can only get aftermarket ones. These Butler Creeks are sold in two versions. One has plastic feed lips. This one, or the two I have, are the steel lips. They're fairly reliable, but they're certainly not as reliable as the official Ruger ones. For sights, I basically picked up some cheap UTG M4 style sights. This is basically your AR-15 style carry handle, which incorporates the rear sight, and an AR-15 or M4 A2 style front sight. Like I said, the gun comes with no sights, and it also comes with no rails. So before you can even put a front sight on it, you're going to have to buy a top rail. So I have the Tough Force rails on here, obviously the full length top rail, which is also full height in that it's flat top with the rail on top of the rear receiver. Of course, that's important for your sights to line up. The other three rails that I have on here are also from Tough Force, but they're just the short rails. And as you can see, there's a big difference in height. If you were to put a rail of this height on the top and then mount your front sight on that, it would obviously be too low in conjunction with the rear sight and would not line up. So like I said, the gun comes with no sights, which is not the best value, but it gives you the opportunity to use the sights that you want to use. So you could see that as a good thing, or you could see that as a bad thing. If you know that you want to use specific sights with it anyways, or maybe you have an AR-15 or an M4 and you are just using this for target practice, you could use the same sights and of course the same optics. Speaking of optics, I do have this cheap Tasco red dot sight. This is nothing special by any means. This is basically a $50 Walmart special, but it does the job. I've used it up to 100 yards and it worked surprisingly well. This gives you really quick target acquisition, as your sight doesn't have to be lined up perfectly. As you can see, it compensates for your point of view. So in other words, when you're using normal sights, such as the sights on here, you would have to line up the front and rear sight with the target. Meaning you essentially have to line up three things. It depends on your point of view. You've got to be looking through the rear sight, and you've got to try and keep the rear sight centered with the front sight on the target. Obviously, with a red dot, like I said, it's compensating for your point of view. You only have to line up the dot with the target. Being a 10/22 internally, there is a lot of aftermarket. If you wanted to change the trigger, or change the extractors, change the charging handle, you can change the magazine release, and essentially there's aftermarket for anything that you would want to change internally. Personally, I don't feel the need. The only mod I would probably be interested in would be an automatic bolt release. The bolt on a Ruger 10/22 does not lock back automatically, and it does not release automatically. I don't lock it back too often, but sometimes at the range when there's other people around, you want to have it locked back so that they can see that your gun is clear. When you want to unlock it, you've got to reach down here and manipulate a small lever located beneath the magazine release. And it's a little finicky, especially if it's cold out. If your fingers are cold, it's a very small little metal, almost like a rocker, and you've got to sort of rock it upwards as you pull the bolt back, as you can see, and the bolt will be released. So one of the common mods is an automatic bolt release. It's a very simple mod. You can either do it yourself or you can buy the part to change inside, and when you pull back on the bolt, it will automatically release. You will not have to reach down here and fiddle with the switch. So that is probably the one and only mod that I would care to change internally. I find the trigger good enough for me, good enough for what I do. Obviously, like I said, I'm not a professional. So do I recommend the Ruger SR-22? Absolutely I do. I would also recommend the Ruger 1022. Like I said, this one's not the best value. It is a fairly expensive gun. Add into the fact it does not come with sights. You have to buy rails and sights or optics to even be able to use it. It becomes even less of a value. An option, like I said, is to pick up a Ruger 1022. You can get those for $250 and change the stock if you want. Some people like the fact it has an aluminum stock system as opposed to some of the plastic alternatives like the Archangel kit or the Tapco stocks. As long as you understand that, it's a little bit more costly and it doesn't include sights, so you have to add that onto the price. I would recommend it. Like I said, for me this was my first gun, and I simply wanted to get what I wanted to get, if that makes sense. In other words, I knew there was cheaper alternatives. I knew there was cheaper routes. Getting a 1022 and then changing the stock I had thought of, but at the end of the day I said no, this is the one I want, so I'm going to spend that little extra because it's my first gun, and I hope to have it around for a long time and just have fun with it. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Someone else may not like this. Someone else might tell you, you wasted your money. You know, you should have got this, or you should have got this, or you should have got this, and then changed this. There's so many options. At the end of the day, what matters is that you got what you like, and get what you want. And that's what I did. The Ruger SR-22, and it has not let me down yet.